Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here we talk all about project management, business and data analysis. My name is Paulus and today we're going to talk about project constraints. Every single project is impacted by project constraints like time and budget. Therefore, understanding them will help you to really ensure that your project can be executed smoothly. Now, constraints, of course, means limitations. And one of those constraints we're going to discuss today is also risk. And these are limitations that could impact your quality and deliverables. Time, budget, scope, and quality are the constraints that you normally talk about. But today we'll also talk about risks and resources. Now, we'll dive into each of those 6 constraints in more detail and understand why they are impacting your project. But before that, if you wouldn't mind smashing that like button, that will help me understand you really enjoyed this content and you would like more of that in the future. Why cost is a project constraint? It's a good question, but obviously if you have been dealing with projects before, you will know the answer to that. I mean, if you are creating any initiative, you need to pay for your staff, you need to pay for software maybe, a new database. So I guess we're quite clear on that. You need to pay for things, and that's why costs need to be considered for any project. One thing to keep in mind though is to always keep a buffer in your estimates. Because cost is one of those constraints that's really hard to adjust later on the project. Resources are usually allocated in the business early in the year. That means that if you ask additional funding later, if you say overspend, you need more things, you might not get it and you might have to wait for next year and you have to maybe put your project on hold. The way you can overspend, you can also underspend. And underspending is also a problem. Because as we said, business allocates resources through the year or for the year. And that means that it expects for you to fully utilize the resources you've been allocating to you because this is what you asked to deliver the value. If you didn't need that funding, that means the business could have used it somewhere else. And that's the problem. It's an opportunity cost for the business. The key, of course, for any corporation is take the finance that it gives you and it wants you to deliver the max value. So you need to be careful on both fronts. Not overspending, but not underspending either. Time is the biggest constraint, I guess, in everybody's life. Same in the project. Heads of the departments or the organization will want to know when they're going to get that value for the business. Also, they will want to know when the resources that are allocated to the project will be available for different initiatives. Well, again, you need to be very careful when you plan your project. Leave some buffer if you need to. If you don't manage your time well, you may miss your deadlines. Also, you may have to rush at the end of the project and maybe sacrifice some quality elements or some scope elements, which means you're not delivering the full value to the business just because you couldn't manage the time. And when you estimate your time, you need to take into consideration not just if you have staff, what you can do in a certain period of time, but also when will that staff be available to you, whether they have any holidays. So you have to go a little bit into next level to understand how much time you'll need for the project. If you have similar projects somewhere else that completed already, you can learn from them and adjust your time estimates based on what they had to deal with. This is, though, more for traditional project management. If you're dealing with agile project management, you'll know that, well, neither agile frameworks like Scrum or Kanban have a very specific deadline. Only if the business allocates a specific deadline, you'll have one. In Scrum, you would normally work until your beta version is ready or MVP is ready for the market. Similar in Kanban. So actually the time management is slightly different here, and if the management accepts that the projects are managed using Scrum and Kanban, the time constraint is a bit less strict. Scope. Well, scope is all about things that are going to be part of the project. So automatically it becomes a constraint. In the scope, you would like to include both things that you put in and things you left out from the project. Thing is that you would always want for your stakeholders to be quite aware of what is within the scope, what's out of the scope. Usually in the middle of the project or later down the line, they'll come around to you and say, well, we want this new additional super great feature, but we don't want to include anything in terms of time, additional time, or costs. And of course, that's a problem. Now, if there are additional features the stakeholders are asking you, that's okay. You just need to go through change management process, consider all the things that it will entail, and then report back to senior stakeholders, your forums like steer calls and working groups, and explain what it takes for this new feature to be implemented. If you're not willing to take additional cost and scope, well, then you may need to advise them that this additional feature may need to be pushed until the next year when the new budget is confirmed. If you don't manage your scope properly, you get what's called scope creep, where different stakeholders keep on pushing on to you various features and you always accept them. That means at some point you have huge amount of scope that you need to deliver in the project, but you have no time or money to deliver that. So maybe the quality will suffer, or you may experience huge risks now. So that was with the traditional project management. Now, if you have an increasing scope in agile projects, this is okay. This is actually something you would expect to have. Agile means you adjust to changing environments. And when the market shifts, you want to make sure that you address new features maybe the client expects to have. You would take those features, and both in Scrum and Kanban, and put in your backlog. You would prioritize them against what you already have there and decide whether it's worth to be implementing right now, later, or not at all. So in a way, in agile world, there's actually scope is competing with itself. If you by any chance get an increase in time and budget, maybe you can include more of the scope elements. Prioritizing scope with itself also helps to make sure that the client always gets the most value. Regardless how you started the project, you adjust it to the most valuable elements that the client expects to have. Now, we discussed time, budgets or costs, and the scope. They combine into one triangle. In the middle of that triangle is quality. A bit of obscure subject because it's harder to measure. Quality really defines the expectations of various stakeholders that you need to collate while you're preparing for the project in the planning stages. Non-functional requirements actually helps you to cover that quality element. Non-functional means how the certain tool need to behave. If you want to learn more about that, just go to Google, type non-functional versus functional requirements, how to be successful inside Spotter, and you'll find my website with a great post I've written about the subject. One example of non-functional requirements could be that you are building a website and you need it to load in 3 to 4 seconds. So that's the requirement. Sometimes you have teams actually in the business that are dealing with quality evaluation. So we have quality assurance team or just the testing team who will take your non-functional requirements and make sure that the tool is actually behaving as you requested it to behave. We have covered 4 main constraints that everyone's talking about. There's also a risk as a constraint in the project. There could be internal or external risks, but regardless what are they, internal or external, you still need to manage them. And it's what's called risk and issues management in projects. Normally, when you have a risk, you will put on a log and will consider how you could address it, whether you need to avoid it, mitigate it, transfer maybe to somebody else. Depending on how likely for something will happen and what the impact will be this seriousness of the risk, right? And depending on your sponsors and senior stakeholders, they may be willing to accept higher or lower risk tolerance. As a result, in some projects, low risks might be troublesome, and in some other projects, high risks might be just okay. However, there could be situations where the risk is so high and impact so huge, and there's nothing you can do about it, that you have to close the project. Good example could be medical or pharmaceutical companies. They produce some medicines, they do a lot of testing, and let's say one of those tests they realize that there's a potential risk to human health. There might be nothing you can do about it. And as a result, you may need to close that particular project and start with a new project, with the similar maybe medicine, but that will be a next step now. If you'd like to learn more about how to maybe track your risks or understand more about your project risks, you can check out the video I just created about SWOT analysis. I'll put it in the link down below or here on the screen. Finally, we're going to discuss resources. These are business resources like physical, financial, human know-how, and reputation. As projects are working in the business environment, they will be impacted by the same resources. If say we have low on finance or low on human capital reputation, that might cause difficulties and risks for delivery of the project successfully. We may need to pay attention to those elements and address our project plans and our management strategies. As an example, you may be building a website as we discussed before, and now you have a database behind, and you need a database architect to be just the right time for you to deliver the project on time. So again, the project is impacted of what it can play with to deliver that value. The last thing what I want to discuss or come back to is time and budget. As I said in the beginning, these are very sensitive topics. And one reason they're so sensitive are because they can be measured. And because they can be measured, people tend to quite clinch on them and always ask questions. So if you have a problem with either time or budget, you need to make sure you have a good story why it's happening or a good understanding, and that you have a great plan to come back on track. If you can see that as a problem and you can't go back on track, you need to make sure you manage your stakeholders very well. And the second you have a problem with that and maybe there's no way out, or even before that, you start communicating it and seeing if there is any other ways out, maybe reducing the scope, reprioritizing elements. Quite often these discussions happen in staircodes. And again, I have a video about that. Just check on my YouTube channel. If you would like to know more about project constraints, I have a few more examples of how those constraints interlink and impact each other on my website. I also have an example there, a business case. So you go to Google, write what are project constraints inside Spotter, and you find it straight there. If you like this video, subscribe, like, and press notification bell. I'm gonna create more of these videos in the future. If you have any suggestions, just leave the comments down below. Also, in my website, you can write to me directly. And I'm gonna see you in the next video. Bye!